On a cool Saturday afternoon in April of 2014, 60-year-old Gary Terrell was crouched down in the dirt, pulling weeds from his beautiful backyard garden. Even though it was only about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, Gary could still feel a bead of sweat dripping down his forehead. Gary also felt a slight ache in his back, and he laughed at himself because digging in the dirt apparently was not as easy as when he was younger. But even with the sweat and the muscle aches, there was still no place Gary would rather be than in his garden on a pretty spring day. Gary and his wife Jan had lived in their house in Springfield, Missouri for over 20 years, and the house itself looked a lot like the other homes in their small suburban neighborhood. It was red brick with a large first floor and a basement, but the landscaping at Gary and Jan's house made it stand out from all the other houses in the area. Landscaping had always been a passion for Gary and Jan. They had spent years working on their flower and vegetable gardens in the back, and they had filled the front yard with plants and various design accents like a concrete bench with cupids and hearts carved into it. Gary slipped off his gardening gloves, stood up, and stretched out his back. Gary was average height with graying hair and a receding hairline. Gary heard the back door open, so he turned and he saw his wife Jan walking towards him. She was carrying a glass of water, and she had a big smile on her face like she usually did. Jan was 61 years old. She had brown hair down to her shoulders, and she wore glasses. When Jan reached Gary, she handed him the glass of water and told him he should really take a break. So they sat down together on a bench, and they talked about what else they could plant to add even more color to their gardens. Then Jan took Gary's hand, and they sat there quietly, just looking out over their perfect yard. The truth was, the garden was much more than just another landscaping project to Gary and Jan. It had been like a sanctuary to them for years. Gary and Jan had met and fallen in love over 30 years earlier in the 1980s. Soon after they had gotten married, they started a family, first welcoming their daughter Jessica, and then their son Jimmy. But when Jimmy was only a toddler, Gary and Jan had gotten the worst news they could imagine. Their little boy had been diagnosed with cancer. After Jimmy's diagnosis, Gary and Jan had moved to the house in Springfield to be closer to medical facilities for their son's treatments. But unfortunately, at the age of 3, Jimmy had passed away. Gary and Jan knew they would never get over the death of their son. But the garden they started in the backyard of their home became their quiet, beautiful place where they could go and sit and remember their son. And soon it became a place where they could retreat from stress and pain and just spend time together. It really was their sanctuary. Over the years, Gary and Jan had started to heal as best as they could from the terrible loss of their son, and they both turned their grief into a desire to help others. Gary had dedicated his life to education and working with children. He had been a history teacher, a school principal, and then he had gone on to serve as the assistant superintendent in his school's district. Jan volunteered her time sewing and crocheting for cancer patients, and even though nobody other than Gary knew, Jan also paid for milk and food items at the local school cafeterias to help cover the costs for kids who couldn't afford to buy those things on their own. And even after Gary had retired from working in the school district for decades, he wanted to remain an educator. So he had taken a position at a local college as an adjunct history instructor. So as much as Gary and Jan loved to escape from the stress and grief of life by going into their garden, they both still believed it was their job to stay engaged in their community and to help others as much as they could. In the garden, Gary finished his water and cleaned up his supplies. Then he and his wife went inside their house. Jan sat down on the living room couch and called their daughter Jessica. Jessica was in her late 20s, and she lived about 300 miles away in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Jan and Gary still talked to their daughter just about every single day. Jessica would call her mom every morning, and her dad would text her every night before he went to bed. But lately, Jessica and Jan had been on the phone with each other even more than usual because Jessica was planning her wedding. And that day, Jan had called Jessica to set up a time for them to go wedding dress shopping together. They decided Jessica would drive up to Missouri in a couple of weeks, stay with her parents, and she and Jan would shop for as long as they needed until she found the perfect dress. While Jan talked to Jessica on the phone, Gary made his way through the first floor of the house towards his home office. It was true that the outside landscaping Gary and Jan had done over the years really did set their house apart, but the inside of their house was also very different from other homes. In fact, the inside of their home wasn't like anything anyone in the neighborhood had ever seen. The inside of Gary and Jan's house was like a small museum or a curiosity shop filled with all kinds of rare items. Gary loved world history. That's why he continued to teach the subject even after he had technically retired. But Gary's love of history had also turned him into an avid collector. At first, Gary had begun collecting things like old books or rare furniture pieces he found at garage sales. But over the years, Gary's collecting had turned into something way bigger than just a hobby. The walls on the first floor of the house were covered with shelves, and those shelves displayed antique handguns and rifles, Native American spearheads, first edition books, jars filled with old coins from all over the world, and countless other collectibles. On his way to his office, Gary stopped for a second in front of a large wooden table that displayed his prized possession, 3 rare 19th century scrimshaw walrus tusks. Scrimshaw was the art of hand-carving detailed pictures or intricate designs into bone or ivory objects like whale and walrus tusks. Gary looked at his prized tusks and he smiled. Each one was worth about $10,000, but their monetary value was not really why Gary loved them so much. As a collector, he had to work hard to track down these kinds of very rare items. He combed through catalogs, visited antique dealers, talked to other collectors, and still went to local garage and estate sales in search of rarities. So these 3 scrimshaw tusks represented a lot of time and effort by Gary. And the artwork and craftsmanship of these 3 pieces just totally blew Gary away. Gary stepped away from the walrus tusk display, walked down a hallway, and went into his office. The shelves in his office were overflowing with books. Some were hard to find and long out of print, and others were just books about history that Gary enjoyed reading. Gary sat down at his desk, and he reached over into a jar that was filled with all these silver coins. Like the walrus tusks, most of these coins were very rare and worth a lot of money, and Gary was on a mission to catalog all of them. Cataloging items in his collection made it much easier for him to trade with other collectors because that way he knew exactly what he had, and he could give others a description of all the objects he owned. But cataloging coins was also kind of like sitting in the garden for Gary. There was something about the sound the coins made when they clinked against each other, and the time it took to determine exactly when and where each coin was from, that brought Gary a real sense of peace. Gary wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting at his desk cataloging these rare coins when his phone buzzed in his pocket and it sort of snapped him out of his peaceful trance. He grabbed his phone and glanced down at the number that was calling him, and he saw it belonged to one of his closest friends, Mark Porter. Mark had been the superintendent of the school district back when Gary was the assistant superintendent, and the 2 men had gotten along really well. It turned out that Mark shared Gary's interest in collecting coins, so the 2 men had remained close friends even after they both had retired. Gary and Mark talked for a few minutes about maybe getting together for dinner soon, and then Mark asked how Gary's work with his latest coin collection was going. The truth was, Mark loved that Gary had this huge collection to spend his time on, but Mark also worried that Gary was a little naive about the world he'd been drawn into. Most collectors and antique dealers were like Gary. They were good people who just had a real love of history. But there were some people who saw collectors like Gary as very easy targets because they were in possession of items that were worth a ton of money. And there were times when Mark worried if Gary really knew enough about the different people he was reaching out to in order to make potential buys or trades with. It wasn't really clear if Gary actually understood if these business partners of his were good people with good intentions or not. On the phone, Gary told Mark that everything was going great with cataloging his coins and he'd be able to see if anyone was interested in buying them soon. And he reassured Mark that he would only work with reputable collectible coin dealers when the time came to actually sell them. Then the 2 friends agreed to meet for dinner the following week, and they said goodbye. Not long after Gary hung up on Mark, Jan walked into the office, and she told Gary that their daughter, Jessica, would be coming up from Oklahoma soon to go shopping for a wedding dress. Gary stood up, and he had a huge grin on his face. He loved when his daughter came to visit, and he knew how happy it made Jan to spend time with their daughter. Gary put his arm around Jan, and the 2 of them walked out of the office and into the living room. They sat down on the couch, and Jan leaned her head on Gary's shoulder. Gary and Jan had been together over 30 years, and they had been through some really horrible things together, but they had come out on the other side. They were happy and healthy and just as much in love with each other as they had been on the day they first got married. A few days later, on April 30th, 2014, Gary kissed Jan by the door that led to their garage, and then Gary headed out to his car. He was going to head out to teach one of his classes at the local college. Jan watched as Gary pulled out of the garage and headed down the driveway, and then once he was gone, Jan shut the garage door and then walked back inside into the living room. She sat down on the couch and called her daughter Jessica. They talked about Jessica's wedding planning, and Jan reminded her that if she needed help with anything, all she had to do was ask. Jessica's house in Oklahoma City was only about a 5-hour drive to Jan and Gary's, and they did see each other fairly often, but Jan secretly wished that Jessica and her fiancé lived closer. And even though Jan didn't say this, she really hoped when Jessica had children of her own, she would move back to Springfield, because Jan would want to be as close to her grandkids as possible. Jan and Jessica talked for a bit longer, and then Jan told her daughter she loved her and she couldn't wait to see her. Jan hung up her phone and then walked across the first floor to the basement door. Now, while she and Gary did call the basement, in reality, it really wasn't. It had been converted into another living space years earlier, complete with a small kitchen, so it was kind of like an apartment. Jan walked down the stairs and into the basement kitchen. She spent a lot of time down there canning vegetables. Jan didn't take canning as seriously as Gary took his collecting, but it was still a hobby she loved. But before Jan could get started canning that day, she thought she heard footsteps upstairs. She knew she'd been on the phone with Jessica for a while, but she still thought it was way too early for Gary to be home from his class. Jan walked over to the basement steps and called upstairs to see if maybe Gary was there, but nobody called back. Then Jan heard heavy footsteps running across the floor right above her, and suddenly her breath was caught in her chest and she felt scared. Then the basement door at the top of the stairs swung open, and Jan looked up and saw someone running down the stairs right at her. The next day, on May 1st, 2014, Jessica, Gary and Jan's daughter, nervously tapped her foot and stared down at her phone inside of her house in Oklahoma City. Jessica was starting to panic because she hadn't heard from either of her parents since she'd talked to her mom the day before, and that wasn't normal. Her dad always texted her to say goodnight no matter where he was or what he was doing, and he didn't do that the night before, and she talked to her mom every morning, and that morning she had not heard from her mom. Jessica's fiancé, Jason, tried to calm her down. He was sure there was a totally normal explanation for why Gary and Jan had stopped being in touch. Maybe they fell asleep early the night before and maybe slept in this morning. But Jessica just couldn't believe that. She knew something was wrong, and so she couldn't relax. Jessica and her mom looked a lot alike. They had the exact same smile, but Jessica had blonde highlights in her shoulder-length brown hair. On this day, Jessica wore a gray sweatshirt and jeans. As for Jessica's fiancé, Jason, he was a big guy, and he was what some people might call the strong, silent type. In their Oklahoma City living room, Jessica got up and started to pace back and forth. At noon, she still had not heard from her parents, and so she really began to feel worried. By this point, Jason could see how upset his fiancé was, and so he told her, just call the police up in Springfield and ask them to do a wellness check on your parents. This would mean a police officer would go to Jan and Gary's house and just knock on the door and make sure everything was okay. Jessica looked up the non-emergency number for the Springfield Police Department, and she gave them a call. She told them she was really worried about her parents, and she gave them her parents' address. The officer on the other line assured her they would send somebody over to the house immediately. Jessica hung up the phone and then sat back down and waited. It felt like hours had passed, but in reality, the police called Jessica back pretty quickly. An officer told Jessica that they had gone by her parents' house, and while they didn't actually talk to her parents, nothing seemed out of the ordinary about their home. The doors were all locked, there was no sign of forced entry anywhere. The house looked totally normal. Jessica thanked the officer for going over and looking around, but after she hung up, she told Jason that that was not good enough for her. She was sure there was something wrong and somebody actually needed to speak to her parents. Jessica tried calling both of her parents again, but again, neither of them answered. So Jessica told Jason that they needed to drive to Springfield to see in person what was going on here. So at about 2 p.m. that day, Jessica and Jason walked outside to their car to begin the 5-hour drive to Springfield. Jason drove as fast as he could, and he and Jessica barely spoke on the ride, and then just a little before 7 p.m., Jason pulled the car into Gary and Jan's driveway. Right away, Jessica reached into her purse, and she took out the garage door opener she had for her parents' house. She pressed the button, and she and Jason watched as the garage door opened up, and inside, Jessica saw both of her parents' cars were parked. And when Jessica saw that, she turned to Jason, and she said now she was certain something terrible had happened. Jessica slowly got out of the car, but she didn't dare go inside the house. Instead, she dialed 911 and waited outside for the police to arrive. A few minutes after Jessica called 911, a police cruiser arrived in front of the house. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of the car and approached Jessica and Jason, who were still standing outside in front of the house. The officers saw the garage door was open and that there were 2 cars parked inside. The officers asked Jessica and Jason if either of them had gone into the house. Jessica said they hadn't, but she was sure something was wrong. She also told them the door that led into the house from the garage was always unlocked. The officers told Jessica to wait outside, and then they walked into the garage. Jessica was right. The door in the garage leading into the house was unlocked. So the officers walked through that door into the house and made their way down a hallway towards the front of the house. And not far from the front door, they saw a man's body lying in a pool of blood with a gunshot wound to his chest. As soon as they saw this, one of the officers called into the station, and then both officers drew their guns and began slowly making their way through the rest of the first floor. The officers were tense. They had no idea if the shooter was still in the house. They didn't find anyone else on the first floor, so they made their way to the basement door, they opened it up, and began going down the stairs, again with their guns drawn. But before even making it halfway down the steps, the officers saw another body. It was a woman lying face down on the floor below. Even from a distance, they could see a gaping wound in the back of her head. Later that evening, Jessica and her fiancé Jason were still anxiously waiting outside. But this whole time, they had stood there and watched multiple police cruisers arrive one after another, and they had watched as police officers blocked off Jessica's parents' house with yellow police tape. One officer had told Jessica and Jason that 2 bodies had been found inside of the house, but those bodies had not been identified yet. However, Jessica knew it had to be her parents, and she'd be right. In the darkness, Jessica watched another car pull up in front of the house. This one was not a police cruiser, but a sedan. And out of the sedan came 2 tall, thin men wearing suits with buzzed brown hair. In the low light, the 2 men could easily pass as brothers. The men approached Jessica and Jason and introduced themselves as detectives Chris Barb and Neil McCamus of the Springfield Police. Like the first officers on the scene, the detectives learned that Jessica and Jason had not gone inside of the house before or after they called 911. Barb and McCamus asked them to continue waiting outside, and then the 2 detectives made their way inside of the house. Once they were inside, they joined the state forensics officers in the front room where Gary's body was lying. The detectives were immediately taken aback by the amount of blood that had pooled around his body, and they soon discovered that Gary had been shot and bludgeoned. While this type of violence was shocking to see, even for these experienced detectives, there were a couple of other things about the scene that really stood out to them. Gary's pants were pulled down to about the middle of his thighs, but Barb and McCamus didn't think it looked like someone had tried to undress Gary. Instead, they thought maybe someone might have dug through Gary's pockets after he was dead, and Gary's pants had sort of slipped off his waist. But Gary's pants being down were not remotely the strangest aspect about the scene. Forensics officers had found white dust and flakes all over Gary's body. It was clear to investigators that the dust was not cocaine or any other kind of drug, but they had no idea what it was. So, as forensics officers collected samples of the white dust for testing, detectives Barb and McCamus followed a uniformed officer across the first floor and down to the basement. At the bottom of the stairs, another forensics officer was crouched over Jan's body. Barb asked if the wounds on Jan's body matched the ones on Gary upstairs, and the officer said only partially, because Jan had not been shot like Gary had been. Barb and McCamus crouched down, and just like upstairs, they saw the same white dust and flakes. They also saw a latex glove turned inside out on the floor, not far from Jan's body. The detectives left the forensics team to do their work in the basement, and they made their way back upstairs and through the rest of the house. Eventually, they went into the garage, and they saw a concrete floor-to-ceiling tornado shelter standing in the corner. Garage shelters like that were pretty common in the area because Missouri was part of what's often called Tornado Alley, an area of the United States that experiences a ton of tornadoes. But detectives Barb and McCamus noticed something strange about this tornado shelter right away. A combination lock had been added to the structure. While locks were not out of the ordinary for outdoor shelters, they weren't that common in garage shelters. Because the idea that during a tornado, people would rush into their garage to get in their shelter and then have to fiddle around with a lock first just felt really unnecessary. And so Barb and McCamus walked over to the shelter to get a better look at this lock. And when they got there, it was clear someone had struck that lock over and over again in a failed attempt to get it to open. So the detectives were pretty sure that Gary and Jan had converted this tornado shelter into a sort of safe, hence the lock. And then whoever had killed them had then tried to break into this safe, meaning whoever had killed them knew Gary and Jan had converted the shelter into a safe. They knew where the safe was, and they very likely had an idea of what was inside of it. And so, for detectives Barb and McCamus, there was now one very obvious suspect: Gary and Jan's daughter, Jessica, who had apparently been so worried about her parents that she drove 5 hours to check on them, but apparently not worried enough to actually go inside the house. Late at night on May 1st, so a few hours after police had arrived at Gary and Jan's house, Detective Barb led Jessica and Jason into a small interrogation room at the police station. Barb motioned to a small wooden table that was pushed up against a wall that looked like it hadn't been repainted in decades. Jessica and Jason sat down at that table, and then Barb took a seat across from them. Barb was calm and measured, and he told Jessica how sorry he was about her loss. But he made it clear there were a few things that seemed really strange to him. Barb couldn't understand why Jessica and Jason had driven all the way from Oklahoma only to arrive at Jessica's parents' house, and then Jessica doesn't go inside to see if her parents need any help. But all Jessica would say in response to this was that as soon as she saw her parents' cars were in the garage, she knew something terrible had happened, and she didn't want to see it. And that was why she had just called the police and waited outside. Detective Barb nodded and jotted down a few notes on a pad of paper. Barb's face never gave anything away, but Jessica's reasoning still seemed very odd to him. And in fact, he had heard answers like Jessica's before. In murder cases, Barb had come into contact with people who left the scene after they had killed their victims and then contacted police to try to remove suspicion from themselves. But these killers would pretend they had not even seen the victims because they simply could not confront what they had done. So they would say things like they knew something was wrong, but that they had no idea what police would actually find inside, when in reality, of course they would know. And that's exactly what Jessica's response sounded like to Detective Barb. Now, he was not ready to just declare Jessica guilty, but he definitely still considered her a major suspect despite her explanation. Because in addition to her strange behavior at the house, Barb and his team had discovered some very important information since they had arrived at Jan and Gary's house that really only began to point more suspicion at Jessica. It turned out that Gary's collection of rare and historical items was worth hundreds of thousands of US dollars. And like police thought, Gary and Jan had converted that garage tornado shelter into a safe. And that safe held tens of thousands of dollars worth of gold and silver. So, Detective Barb knew that Jessica was the only child of wealthy parents, and she stood to inherit a lot of money when her parents died. In the interrogation room, Barb's voice remained totally calm, almost casual, like he was talking to a friend. He asked Jessica if she was angry at her parents for any reason, but Jessica just looked at him and shook her head no. She said her parents were her whole life. Then, Barb asked her if she had resented her parents for keeping their money from her or anything like that. And a confused and almost angry look suddenly came across Jessica's face. She told Barb that if she ever wanted money, or anything else from her parents for that matter, all she had to do was ask and they'd give it to her. Barb thanked Jessica and Jason for coming in, and then he let them go. Jessica might be a prime suspect, but Barb knew he needed a lot more evidence to be able to hold her. So Detective Barb and McCamus regrouped and started to put together a list of people who were close to Gary and Jan and who might have information about the crime or about Jessica. And the first person they wanted to talk to was Gary's friend and fellow collector, Mark Porter. At 7 p.m. on May 2nd, the day after Gary and Jan's bodies had been discovered, Mark Porter sat in an interrogation room similar to the one Jessica and Jason had been in the day before. Mark was 53 years old, and he was tall and handsome with salt and pepper hair. Detective Barb was once again handling the interview, and he asked Mark if he knew of any friends or family that might have wanted to harm Gary and Jan. But Mark shot down that idea right away. People in the community loved Gary and Jan because they both spent so much of their time helping other people. And Mark said as for their daughter, Jessica, she loved her parents and had a great relationship with them. Before Barb could press him further, Mark said there was a much more obvious path investigators should be following. Mark said he was almost positive that Gary and Jan had been killed because of something having to do with Gary's collection. And he added that someone could have stolen stuff from Gary worth thousands of dollars, and it would be almost impossible to know it was missing because Gary had amassed such a large collection of all different kinds of rare items. Then Mark shook his head and fell silent. Detective Barb asked him what was wrong, and Mark just kept shaking his head. Then he looked up at Barb and said that he had seen at least one text message exchange between Gary and a potential buyer, and something about this exchange had just seemed off to Mark. Mark told Barb that he had tried to warn Gary not to go into business with this guy in the text messages, but now Mark said he wished he had really pushed Gary to truly walk away from that deal. Detective Barb thanked Mark for his time and for the information he'd provided. And after Mark left, Barb met with the rest of the investigative team. None of the investigative team were familiar with the world of collectors that Gary and Mark and others were a part of, but they all knew that when it came to things worth a lot of money, there were going to be people involved who would do anything to other people to get their hands on those items. Now, Barb needed to figure out if something, one of the collectibles or multiple collectibles, were missing from Gary's house. Police could go through Gary's catalogs, but there was no guarantee that everything Gary had ever collected would be listed in those catalogs, so this was going to be a really difficult chore. So Barb reached out to Gary's brother to see if maybe he could help. Gary's brother was a respected attorney in the area, and he was probably more familiar with Gary's complete collection than anyone, because he had helped Gary with legal and financial issues related to collecting some of these rare objects. Detective Barb wasn't willing to rule Jessica out as a suspect, but what Mark had said did make a lot of sense, and investigators started focusing on the murders as possibly being the result of a robbery, and they hoped either Gary's brother or the test results from the mysterious white dust they were waiting on would lead them to the killer. On May 10th, so 10 days after Jan and Gary's murders, their daughter Jessica stood at the front of a massive crowd that had gathered inside of a high school gym. The outpouring of love for Jan and Gary from the community had been overwhelming, and it became clear that a funeral home would not be large enough to accommodate everybody who wanted to pay their respects to Gary and Jan. So the school district, where Gary had worked for decades, let the family use a local high school gym for a memorial service. But as Jessica listened to friends and other family members talk about how much her parents had meant to them, one thought kept coming into her mind. This was the day she was supposed to go dress shopping with her mom, and now her parents wouldn't even get to be there for her wedding, and they would never get to meet their grandkids. Jessica just started sobbing, and Jason wrapped his arms around her and pulled her face to his chest. The fact that Jessica had lost her parents was devastating, but Jason could not believe that on top of that, she also had to endure being a primary suspect in their murders. After the service was over, Jason stood by Jessica outside the gym as she greeted people she had known since she was a kid. And most of them were also appalled that she was being treated like a suspect. Finally, Jessica's uncle, so Gary's brother, approached them and gave Jessica a hug. He didn't believe Jessica would ever do anything to hurt her parents, but as an attorney, he understood why police had focused on her. After all, she was the sole heir to her parents' fortune, and she had acted a little strange at their house on the day that Gary and Jan's bodies were discovered. But he was sure Jessica would soon be crossed off the suspect list, and he was also determined to help police discover if anything really had been stolen from Gary's collection. In the following weeks, with Gary's brother's help, investigators started to believe they were getting closer to identifying Jan and Gary's killer. But they still needed more evidence to be sure they were right and to create an airtight case that would actually hold up in court. But as more time passed, the people who were closest to Gary and Jan put added pressure on the police because they felt like the investigation had started to drag. And on top of that, some of Gary and Jan's friends and neighbors had begun to get frightened because they had no idea if Gary and Jan had been the killer's only target or if they too were also in danger. 3 months after Jan and Gary's murder, Gary's friend, Mark Porter, sat in the small lobby of a quick-service oil change garage. Mark sipped on a cup of coffee from a fast food restaurant and waited for his oil change to be finished. Then, a man walked in and sat down right next to Mark, which was odd because there were plenty of other seats available in the lobby. But Mark didn't think too much about it. He just kept drinking his coffee. Then this man started to talk to Mark. It was just small talk, and Mark responded politely. Finally, Mark heard someone behind the counter call his name. Mark put down his coffee, nodded to the stranger who had been talking to him, paid for his oil change, and then went outside to his car. But as Mark drove away, he got this weird, uneasy feeling in his stomach. Who was that guy, and why had he sat down right next to him and just started talking to him? It just felt odd. When Mark got home, he started to worry that that strange guy might be somehow connected to the murders of Gary and Jan. But as Mark continued to fret over the next few days about this mystery guy and what he meant, Detectives Barb and McAmis decided they were ready to make an arrest. Because they now knew what had been stolen from Gary's collection, and they knew what that mysterious white dust was that was found at the scene. So they were sure about who had killed Gary and Jan and how they had done it. Based on evidence found at the murder scene, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and the test results from the white dust and flakes found inside of Gary and Jan's home, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night of April 30th, 2014, when someone murdered Gary and Jan Terrell. It was still light outside, so the killer casually walked up to Jan and Gary's front door as if they were just there for a visit. They had a large gym bag with them slung over their shoulder. From the porch, the killer glanced over their shoulder to make sure none of the neighbors were outside. Satisfied, the killer reached into their pants pocket and pulled out a pair of latex gloves. The killer slipped on the gloves and then reached into their other pocket and pulled out a key. They used that key to open the door, and they stepped inside. The house was quiet. The killer started down the hallway towards Gary's office, but then they heard a voice calling from downstairs in the basement. The killer froze and started to panic. Then the voice in the basement called out again, at which point the killer made a decision on the spot. The killer rushed to a wooden table nearby and grabbed one of those 3 scrimshaw walrus tusks that were on display. Then the killer, carrying one of those tusks, ran across the first floor towards the basement. They flung open the basement door and quickly descended the stairs. In the basement, Jan, who was the one calling upstairs, she began to scream. She saw the killer rushing towards her, so she turned away from the stairs, but there was nowhere for her to go. The killer reached the bottom of the stairs and caught up to Jan. They clutched that walrus tusk in both hands like a baseball bat, and then they swung. The tusk cracked the back of Jan's head and she fell face down onto the floor. Blood immediately spilled from the wound, but the killer thought they could still hear her breathing. So the killer stood over Jan's body, raised up the walrus tusk again, and slammed it back down into the back of Jan's head multiple times. With each blow to the back of Jan's head, white dust and flakes fell off of that tusk. It would later be determined that the killer had used so much force when smashing Jan's head with that tusk that pieces of Jan's hair were literally embedded into her skull. Finally, the killer stopped smashing Jan's head with the tusk. They stood there for a second and then went back to the basement stairs and headed back up to the first floor. Everything had happened so quickly that the killer didn't realize one of their latex gloves had slipped off their hand and fallen near Jan's body. Upstairs, the killer made their way past the front door, down the hall, and into Gary's office, still clutching the bloody tusk in one of their hands. Once in the office, they grabbed something off the desk, opened up their bag, and dropped it inside. But before the killer could take anything else, they heard the front door open. Again, the killer froze up and began to panic. Then they made another split decision. They opened up one of the desk drawers, pulled out a handgun that was inside, and then ran out of the office down the hall. When the killer got to the front door, Gary, who was the one who had opened the door, he was standing there and he was calling out for his wife. The killer shouted at Gary, and Gary turned to see them, at which point the killer raised the gun and fired. The bullet struck Gary in the chest. Blood spattered across Gary's clothes and he fell to the floor. The killer had no idea if Gary was alive or dead, but they weren't going to take any chances, so they stood over him, raised up the walrus tusk, and smashed Gary with it. Again, white flakes and dust from the tusk fell to the floor. Eventually, the killer stopped bludgeoning Gary and just stood there in the front room, breathing heavily and feeling totally crazed. Gary and Jan were now dead. The killer tried to collect themselves and calm down their breathing. Then they slipped the tusk and the gun into their bag. They got down on the floor and reached into Gary's pockets, searching for money or other valuables. Gary's pants slid down his legs as the killer did this, but the killer did not find anything of note in Gary's pockets. So the killer walked back through the house and went into the garage. There, they grabbed a hammer from Gary's tool rack and then walked over to that tornado shelter that they knew had gold and silver inside, and the killer began smashing at the lock with the hammer. But when it became clear that they could not break this lock, the killer just put the hammer back and went back inside the house. They walked past Gary's body, opened the front door, and stepped outside. It had gotten darker outside, but there was still light, so the killer tried to act as casually as they could as they locked the front door behind them, then got into their car and drove out of the neighborhood. Later that night, the killer sat down on the couch in their home, reached into the bag they had brought to Gary and Jan's house, and took out the item they had stolen from Gary's desk. It was a jar that was filled with old coins. The killer wished they could add these coins to their own collection, but instead, the killer would sell these coins as fast as they could. Mark Porter, Gary's friend and former co-worker, had been the one who murdered Gary and Jan. It would turn out Mark was in massive debt due to gambling losses and other poor financial decisions. And weeks before the murder, he had asked his friend Gary to borrow a staggering $250,000 US. Gary had been totally stunned by this request. He thought Mark was doing really well financially, and he had no idea why Mark would assume that he, Gary, had enough money to just casually give away $250,000, and so Gary had said no. Mark had said he understood and that he wouldn't press Gary anymore about the loan, but in reality, Mark had actually decided that he would go into Gary and Jan's house when Gary was off teaching a class so he could raid Gary's collection himself for some of his more high-end items and then sell them on the collector's market. Being a coin collector himself, Mark knew the worth of Gary's very rare coin collection, and he also knew the worth of a lot of the other items Gary had. So, on April 30th, Mark made his way into Gary and Jan's house to do this robbery. Investigators don't know if he stole the key he used to get inside, or if maybe Gary and Jan had given him the key since he was a friend, but either way, that was how he got in with that key. And so Mark had entered the house with the intention of just robbing Gary, but then Gary's wife, Jan, shouted from the basement, and suddenly Mark's plan fell apart. Mark grabbed the walrus tusk and rushed downstairs and beat Jan to death. But when Mark heard Gary come home, he wasn't sure if the tusk would be enough. He knew Gary kept a handgun in his desk drawer, so he grabbed it and shot Gary, and then followed it up with smashing him with the tusk as well. While investigators had initially considered Jessica their primary suspect, they were eventually able to place her at a restaurant in Oklahoma City at the time of her parents' murder. And it turned out that her reasons for not actually going into her parents' house when she drove all that way to see if they were okay were totally legitimate. When Jessica saw her parents' cars parked there, when she couldn't get in touch with them and nobody knew what was going on with them, she really did just have this gut instinct that something horrible had happened to them, and she just could not bear to see it for herself. And so that was why she had not gone in. So when Jessica was off their suspect list, investigators started digging into the possibility that someone from the collecting world had killed Gary and Jan like Mark had suggested. But then Gary's brother realized that a huge stash of rare coins was missing from Gary's office. And not long after that, police received a call from a local shop that bought, sold, and traded rare coins. And they had a video of a man who had recently sold a large coin collection for over $18,000, and the man on that video was Mark Porter. At this point, detectives Barb and McAmis thought they were close to catching their killer, but there was still a chance that Mark had simply sold some of his own coins, so they needed more proof that what he sold was actually Gary's. They asked Mark to submit a DNA sample to see if maybe they could tie it to DNA found at the scene, but Mark refused. So the police sent in an undercover cop to get the DNA sample. And so it would turn out Mark had every right to be suspicious of that stranger who had come in and sat down right next to him and chatted with him while his car was being worked on, because that stranger was an undercover police officer who ultimately left with Mark's coffee cup that he left behind inside. And the crime lab was able to connect DNA samples from the coffee cup to DNA samples that were found on the latex glove that had been left behind at the murder scene in the basement near Jan's body. Finally, detectives Barb and McAmis learned that the white dust and flakes found near the bodies had come from a walrus tusk similar to the two they had seen on display at Gary's house, so they knew what weapon Mark had used to attack and kill Jan, and then also to bludgeon Gary with after he had shot him. Mark pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received 2 consecutive life sentences. He'll be eligible for parole after he turns 82 years old. Jessica was able to speak at Mark Porter's sentencing, but she refused to put the focus on Mark. Instead, she focused on her parents, saying she would miss her parents' advice and their laughter, and she would miss telling them she loved them. It was mid-June 2014 in Highland Springs, a small blue-collar town about 4 miles outside of Richmond, Virginia. By 3 p.m. that day, it would be hot, 91 degrees Fahrenheit. But right then, at 6:30 in the morning, it was cool. With the sun fully visible in the sky, 16-year-old Martre Coles watched from the living room window of his family's single-story plain white house as his father climbed into his car, turned on his engine, and drove off to work. After he was gone, Martre left the window and walked through the empty house to his bedroom. Once inside, he sat down at his desk, he opened his sketchbook, and he started to draw. Unlike his usual artwork, which consisted of anime-stylized faces and figures full of color, energy, and movement, the faces that he drew that morning were done in thick black marker and were angry and sad. He drew X's instead of eyes, and he put slash marks where the mouths should go. A few minutes later, Martre put down the marker, he put his face in his hands, and he started to cry. 5 days earlier, on June 14th, 2014, Martre's beloved mother, 42-year-old Karina Coles, had died unexpectedly following complications from what was supposed to be routine hip surgery. Martre was beyond devastated. Over the last few years, he had become very close with his mother, as he was the last child of 8 siblings to still be living at home with the parents. His father, Maurice, had always been very hard on him, but his mother had always been his #1 cheerleader, always encouraging him to keep a portfolio of the video game characters and intricately illustrated storylines that he loved to create. She told him she was certain his artwork skills would land him a great job someday. And even though Martre didn't always feel as confident in himself as she did, it was nice to hear her say things like that. With his mother's funeral just 2 days away, the only thing keeping Martre going was the thought that his mom would never want him to just give up or to give in to the crushing depression and sadness he was feeling. And so Martre lifted his face out of his hands, he wiped away his tears, then he ripped the angry, sad drawings he had just made out of his sketchbook and he balled it up and he threw it in the trash. He wished he could talk to his dad about how terrible he was feeling right now, but he knew his dad wouldn't want to listen. He never did. Martre's father barely spoke to him, and whenever he did, it was almost always to be critical of him. As Martre sat there motionless in his desk seat, he suddenly hoped that his father's friend, a 45-year-old woman named Denise Gay, wouldn't be coming by again that night. Denise worked with Martre's dad at a food packaging company called Smithfield Foods. She had 2 children of her own, a 9-year-old little girl and a 19-year-old daughter who lived on her own 90 minutes away. Martre had no issue with Denise herself. She was perfectly nice, but Martre just didn't like that there was this new woman spending time in their house so soon after his mom had died. It just felt inappropriate. Martre had also quietly hoped that his mother's death would bring him and his father closer together, but the opposite was happening. Instead of turning to his son in this difficult time, Maurice was turning more and more to Denise. By June 21st, just 1 week after Martre's mother's death, Denise was coming over their house nearly every night. And in mid-July, just 1 month after Martre's mother's death, Maurice announced to Martre and his other siblings that Denise, along with her 9-year-old daughter Alana, were going to be moving in with him and with Martre. Despite protests from Martre's older sisters, Michelle and Marquisha, that their father's relationship was progressing way too fast, and that Martre was still very emotionally fragile following his mother's death, Maurice had made up his mind. He didn't care what Martre's feelings about the situation were. A couple days later, when Denise and Alana pulled up outside of Martre's house with their bags in hand, Martre stayed inside. He didn't want to see them. But his father began angrily yelling for him to come outside and meet his new family and help his stepsister with her luggage. Martre sighed and stood up and walked outside. He didn't smile at them, but he waved, and then he walked over to Alana to offer to carry her bag inside. But when he reached her, she clutched her bag more tightly to her chest. Then she glared at him angrily, and then she very intentionally threw her bag at his feet. Martre was annoyed, and he looked up at her like, "What are you doing?" But he didn't say anything. He just bent down, grabbed her bag, and then led the way back into the house. Later that day, Martre's older sisters called him to let him know that he was welcome to stay with them anytime he wanted. They knew his new living situation with Denise and Alana was going to be super awkward, and they knew Martre was just hurting from the death of their mother and he really needed someone around him that actually cared about him. Martre thanked them and said, "Yep, sure, I'll come by sometime," but secretly, Martre knew he probably wouldn't. He just didn't have the energy to do anything these days. According to Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn Knight, who was a fellow student at Highland Springs High School, Martre had big plans for his future, plans that his mother had encouraged him to pursue. Martre wanted to get into the best art school he possibly could, and then with that degree, he could try to land a highly coveted job as a video game artist and animator. And so over the first few months that Denise and Alana were living with him, Martre did his best to completely ignore them and instead spend his time and energy on his artwork. And over those first few months, Martre's art skills got noticeably better, and he started branching out from drawing and painting into the creation of elaborate and beautiful papier-mâché masks. But perhaps the most significant thing about this particular period of time in Martre's life was that after about 6 months of living with Denise, his resentment for her had given way to affection. She could never replace his mother, but she was very kind to him, and slowly, she had become a maternal figure to him. She had become someone he turned to when he was down. However, as much as Martre's relationship with Denise seemed to be evolving in a positive way, his relationship with her daughter Alana was going the other direction. Alana was clearly unhappy living with the Coles, and so she took out her frustration by constantly picking fights with Martre. At first, it was just small stuff like stealing the TV remote from Martre or being loud and obnoxious to annoy him. But eventually, it turned into more elaborate torment. Specifically, Alana realized that Maurice, Martre's father, would always take her side over his son's. And so using that information, she began breaking things around the house and telling Maurice that Martre did it. And every time, despite Martre proclaiming his innocence, Maurice would scream and yell at him and punish him in some way. Alana also quickly realized how important Martre's art was to him, and so she would routinely sneak into his room and vandalize his sketches and his masks. Martre had tried turning to Denise for help, but he was finding that she seemed to be in denial about how badly behaved her daughter really was. Martre also sensed that Denise was desperate to maintain her relationship with his father, and so she probably didn't want to fully acknowledge just how bad it was getting between he and Alana, because doing that would call their entire living arrangement into question, which would potentially jeopardize their future together as a cohesive family. And so Denise really didn't do anything to stop her daughter. Finally, in the winter of 2016, so 2 years after Denise and Alana had moved in, the tension in the household boiled over into violence. Early one afternoon, when Maurice and Denise were still at work and Martre was sitting on the couch in the living room, Alana slipped into the kitchen, she opened the utensil drawer, and she pulled out a pair of utility scissors with long pointed blades. And then the 12-year-old walked back into the living room where Martre was, and she snuck up behind him, she pulled out the scissors, and then she leapt around the corner and she jumped on top of him and attempted to stab him in the heart. And Martre at the last second reached up and kind of pushed her arm out of the way, but the blades dug into his left shoulder and they went in deep. Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, remembers the very angry call she got from Martre that night after Denise had cleaned and bandaged the wound on his shoulder and had apologized on behalf of Alana, but that was it. And so for Martre, this was the breaking point. He was furious that his father and Denise had just totally let the situation with Alana get completely out of control, and he was just kind of scared of Alana. That was a real attack on him. And so as he talked to Ashlyn that night, he said to her, I really need to start actually focusing on how I'm going to execute my plan and actually get into art school and get out of this insane household and go pursue my dreams. And Ashlyn agreed, and she encouraged him and said, yes, go do that. And so in mid-December 2016, Martre worked up the courage to go approach his father and ask him if he would sit down with Martre and try to fill out some financial paperwork that would help him get funding to go to college. And as he's trying to explain to his dad why he needs this funding and what he's going to do with his degree, Maurice, his dad, just kind of puts his hand up and says, you know what? I didn't go to college. I don't understand any of this stuff. You're on your own, kid. Martre was kind of crushed because he needed his dad to fill in the paperwork to be eligible for financial aid. But luckily, Denise was sitting nearby. She had overheard the conversation, and after Maurice had left the room, she pulled Martre aside and said, you know what, don't worry about it. I will get the information you need. I'll help you fill it out. We'll get you into college. You'll be fine. And so over the next few months, with Denise's help and encouragement, Martre not only filled out the financial aid paperwork, but he also sent out applications and letters of inquiry to various art colleges. And then, in March of 2017, roughly 3 years since his mother had died, Martre received the best news he had ever gotten. On March 4th at 4:17 in the afternoon, while Martre worked at his computer, he heard the ping of an incoming email. One click later, and he was reading an invitation from Full Sail University, an art school in Florida, asking him if he would like to come take a personalized tour of their campus. The administrator who had sent the email, Sheila Crenshaw, told Martre that she and her staff had been very impressed with the pictures of his artwork that he had sent along, and so they would love to get to know him and see if the school was a good fit. Sheila told Martre that if he wanted to come and do this tour, to be sure to bring along at least one of his papier-mâché masks, as well as his portfolio of drawings. Martre was so excited, he leapt from his chair and he ran into the room next door where Denise was, and after telling her the good news, she jumped up too, and the pair laughed and hugged and talked about how it was really happening. Martre was really going to go to art school and pursue his dreams. After they calmed down, Denise booked Martre a seat on a bus that would take him from Richmond, Virginia to Florida on Sunday, March 12th. The tour was scheduled for the following Monday. After his travel was booked, Martre realized he only had 8 days until he would be leaving, so right away he got to work making a special papier-mâché mask that he would bring along. He wanted to make sure he really impressed the Full Sail staff. On March 11th, the night before Martre was scheduled to ride out to Florida, Martre stayed with his older sister Michelle at her house. They spent the evening excitedly talking about his potential future at Full Sail and how happy this invitation would have made their mother, whose birthday was coming up later that month. The next morning, Michelle and Martre hopped in Michelle's car, and she began driving toward Martre's house. Their dad had agreed to give Martre a ride to the bus station later that day. When they arrived, Michelle gave her brother a big hug, she wished him good luck, and told him to text her as soon as he got to Florida, and he said he would. After Michelle got back in her car and she began to drive to work, she felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. She knew her little brother still missed their mother terribly, and even talked about his own death and how, at least when that happened, he would be with their mom. But finally, this invitation to Full Sail seemed like the break he so desperately needed. When Martre walked into his house that morning, Denise and her older daughter, Latoya, were both in the kitchen chatting and drinking coffee. When Denise saw Martre, she told him that his dad had apparently got called into work that day, so he couldn't give him a ride to the bus stop. However, she and her daughter didn't mind. He thanked them, and then he sat down with them, and for a few minutes the trio drank their coffee and chatted about Full Sail and other things. And then eventually, Martre told them that he still needed to pack, so he got up and he headed to his bedroom. As he got his clothes and his papier-mâché mask and other artwork together, he smiled. In less than an hour, he'd be on a bus headed to Florida, and he'd be officially pursuing his dreams. Since Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, had known she would not see Martre in person before he left for Florida, and they both knew that Martre might not be able to charge his phone during the 18-hour-long bus ride, they had arranged for Martre to text her as soon as he got on the bus so she could say goodbye. But at the time Martre should have been on the bus texting her, he didn't. He didn't text, he didn't call, it was just silent. And over the course of the morning, despite Ashlyn calling and texting him repeatedly, Martre never responded. Around noon, Ashlyn called Martre's sisters, Michelle and Marquisha, asking if they had heard from their brother, and they said no. By late afternoon, when still there was silence from Martre, Ashlyn, Michelle, and Marquisha were becoming frantic. They all knew that even 3 years after his mother's death, Martre still suffered occasional deep bouts of depression when he started thinking about his mom. And so the 3 young women started worrying that he might have harmed himself. That's why they're not hearing from him. So at 4 p.m. that afternoon, Martre's sisters rushed to their father's house to see what their father and Denise knew. And when they got there, they met up with Denise and Latoya, who were out in the front yard. And after listening to Martre's sisters, Denise was stunned. She had been with Martre that morning. She had seen him leave. What could have happened? How could anything be wrong? But when Maurice, who at some point had come outside to see what was going on, heard the news, he was completely unconcerned that his son seemed to have just vanished right off the face of the earth. He told his daughters that Martre hadn't even been gone long enough to have reached Florida. It was an 18-hour trip. He probably was just asleep on the bus. And if he didn't show up at school tomorrow for the tour, well, Martre was 19 years old. He was an adult, so whatever he wanted to do, that was on him. Completely unsettled by their father's utter indifference about this, Martre's sisters left the house and met up with Ashlyn, who was now hysterical. After they calmed her down, the 3 women eventually decided that their best bet right now was just to search the neighborhood for Martre. Denise said she had dropped him off at the bus stop, but she didn't actually see him get on the bus and literally drive away. So the 3 young women are thinking, okay, well, maybe Martre never got on the bus. Maybe he's still in town somewhere. So the trio spread out all across Highland Springs. They went to local stores, to the high school, to the basketball court. They called and texted all of Martre's friends, but no one had seen or heard from Martre. The next morning, Monday, March 13th, they called Full Sail University to see if Martre had arrived for his tour, and the answer was no. Immediately, Michelle and Marquisha jumped in their car and they headed for the local police station where they filed a missing persons report on their brother. They gave the police a picture and description of Martre, but police told them that because Martre was an adult and there was no sign of foul play, there really wasn't much they could do. Meanwhile, Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, who knew Martre's email password, decided to take a closer look at Martre's invitation from Full Sail University. When he had shown it to her 10 days earlier, she had noticed something slightly off about it, but she had forgotten all about it once they had read the good news and were celebrating. But now, when she logged into his email account and opened up the invitation again, she immediately saw why she thought the email was concerning.
The email had not been sent from an official Full Sail University account. Instead, it had come from someone's personal Gmail account, a woman named Sheila Crenshaw. Ashlyn pulled out her cell phone and she called Full Sail again. And a few minutes later, Ashlyn's worst fears were confirmed. No one by that name worked at the university. But shockingly, when Martre's father, Maurice, was told about this new wrinkle about the email address and how this meant Martre was almost certainly tricked or scammed before he went missing, Maurice still appeared unconcerned, and he refused to reach out to the police himself. 8 days later, Martre's mother's birthday came and went, and still there was no trace of Martre. Since their mother's death, all of the siblings started getting together on her birthdays to celebrate her life and spend time together, and Martre cherished these get-togethers. So for him not to at least text or call his family on her birthday was very significant. It was starting to feel almost likely that he had taken his own life. But just a week later, everything would change. On April 2nd, 2017, 3 weeks after Martre was reported missing, a man named Larry Anderson was walking in a wooded area near where the Coles lived when he spotted a strange green plastic bin tucked away inside of a thick bush. He walked off of the trail to get a better look at it, but when he got close enough to actually see what was inside of this bin, he stopped where he was, he pulled out his phone, and he dialed 911. When the police arrived, they found Larry, who was visibly very shaken up, and he was pacing along the trail a couple hundred feet away, and then the police moved from Larry to the actual bin under the bush, and when they got up close, they saw what Larry saw. There was clearly a foot with a sneaker on it poking out of the bin. When they removed the cover of the bin completely and actually got a full view inside, they saw the dead body of a young man folded up like an accordion crammed inside. He was wearing blue jeans and he had a dark sweatshirt on. His knees were jackknifed up against his chest at an impossible angle, and his hands were bound behind his back with purple duct tape. There were no obvious wounds on his body. However, an autopsy would later reveal that the cause of his death was suffocation. The medical examiner also told police that present in the blood were high levels of two drugs, the sleep agent trazodone and the club drug gamma-butyrolactone, which makes users feel relaxed and euphoric. Even though there was no wallet or ID on this body, when detectives ran a general description of the young man's appearance through their database, right away they found a match to a missing person report that had been filed 3 weeks earlier on March 13th. The deceased young man inside of the storage bin was Martre Coles. Before the police told Martre's family the horrible news, they received a surprising phone call from another police sergeant. He had heard about the murder, and he had just connected Martre's name and his address to a false burglar alarm that 2 of his officers had responded to on March 31st, which was 2 days before Martre's body was discovered. After following up on this very bizarre connection the sergeant had made, and using evidence they had found at the scene where Martre's body was discovered, police were able to slowly, bit by bit, piece together the story of who killed Martre and why. Back on Friday, March 31st, so 2 days before Martre was found, that sergeant's 2 police officers responded to a burglar alarm at Martre's home. When they arrived at Martre's home, Alana came to the door. Standing next to her was her older sister, Latoya. Now, neither of these 2 responding officers had any idea that there was a missing person report out on another member of their family. Latoya told the officers that she was really sorry that the burglar alarm they were responding to was actually a false alarm. She told them, while glaring down at her sister Alana, that her younger sister had deliberately set the alarm off and she was about to be punished for it. The police asked a few more questions, and then, feeling satisfied that this really was just a false alarm because this kid pulled it, they turned around to leave. But before they did, Alana suddenly blurted out, "Can I talk to you guys, please, alone?" And then Alana promptly stepped forward away from her sister out of the house into the evening darkness, and she and one of the officers walked over to the police car they had come in on, while the other police officer stayed put at the door with Latoya, keeping her from going out there. Once Alana was far enough away that she didn't think Latoya or any of her other family members in the house could hear her, she turned to the officer and told him a story that was so outrageous and so unexpected that it just did not seem true. And so after Alana was done telling this story and had gone back inside with Latoya and the door had shut and the two responding officers said bye and they were leaving, they discussed it in the car, those two officers, and they decided there's no way that could be true. And so when they got back to the station, they filed their report as usual, describing that this was a false alarm. And then they also wrote down in this report what Alana told them, her crazy story. But they didn't alert anyone to this story. They just basically made a note of it. And then they filed their report with their sergeant and thought nothing of it. 3 days later, when their sergeant learned that the murder victim found in the storage bin was Alana's stepbrother, the sergeant suddenly remembered the report and realized the story Alana had told his officers might actually be true. Based on a combination of Alana's story, along with other pieces of evidence that the police collected, the following is a reconstruction of what actually happened to Martre. Back on the morning of Sunday, March 12th, so the day Martre was scheduled to take the bus to Florida, his older sister Michelle dropped him back off in front of his house and gave him a hug before she left for work. When Martre walked through the front doors into his house, Denise and her daughter Latoya were sitting in the kitchen. Martre sat down, and as the trio chatted, Martre didn't realize the cup of coffee he was drinking was almost certainly laced with the two drugs that the medical examiner would later find in his system, trazodone and gamma-butyrolactone. By the time Martre got up from the table and headed to his bedroom to pack for his trip to the college, the drugs would have likely begun taking effect. As he stepped into his bedroom, he likely would have started to wonder why he was feeling so crushingly tired and lethargic. He also was probably wondering why Denise and Latoya had followed him into his room and pushed his door most of the way closed without saying a word. Across the hall, Alana was in her room when she heard a loud shout. The voice was weak, but the words were clear. "Get off of me!" She recognized the voice as Martre's. She stepped out of her bedroom and pushed the door of Martre's room open a little to see what was going on, and what she saw was Martre on his back on the ground, and her mother, Denise, standing over his head while kind of bent forward. She was pressing her hands directly down onto his chest, basically putting all of her weight onto his chest, crushing him. Alana's sister, Latoya, was sitting on Martre's legs trying to hold them down because Martre was kicking her and trying to get up. As Martre continued to yell out for them to get off of him, his voice became weaker and weaker as he wasn't able to fully expand his chest to get a full breath because Denise was crushing his chest. Suddenly, Denise looked up and she saw Alana standing in the doorway. Without releasing the pressure on Martre's chest, she simply said to Alana in an unnaturally calm voice, "Nothing is happening. Go back to your room." Alana, who had learned over the years that it was a bad idea to cross her mother, did what she was told, and she kind of backed out into the hallway, and then a few steps more and she was behind her closed bedroom door, her heart pounding wildly. Back inside of Martre's room, Denise was starting to panic. She wished Alana hadn't seen, but now if she didn't finish Martre off, his yells for help, as weak as they were, might alert others. So while keeping the pressure firmly applied to his chest, Denise looked around and saw the papier-mâché mask Martre had so carefully made for his trip to the college laying on the ground near them. She took one hand off of his chest, so she's still pressing with the other, and she reached and she picked the mask up, and then she placed it over Martre's face, completely blocking his nose and mouth, and then began pressing down on his face as well. Then she leaned forward and put her knee into the center of his chest, right on his sternum, and put all of her weight onto her knee, and then she shifted the hand that had been on his chest up to his throat, and she began pressing as hard as she could on his throat. And so she maintained all 3 points of pressure, his chest, his neck, and his face, until Martre stopped moving. A few minutes later, across the hall in her bedroom, Alana heard the sound of something plastic being dragged over the floor. Although terrified, she opened her bedroom door just enough to look into the hallway, and this time she saw her sister Latoya pulling a large, heavy green storage bin across the floor. A few minutes later, Alana looked out her bedroom window and she saw her mother and sister hoist this green tub into the back of Denise's car, and then the two of them drove away. After they were gone, Alana quietly closed the door to her bedroom, and then she sat on her bed, and she's thinking to herself, this has to be a dream. This can't be real. But then later that day, when Martre's sisters came over to their house in a total panic, saying that Martre wasn't responding to any texts or calls and we think he's missing, that's when Alana knew this had not been a dream. What she had just seen had really happened. Over the next few days, Alana kept hoping that Martre would just show up, that he'd walk through the door and that everything would go back to normal. But that didn't happen. And 19 days later, on March 31st, Alana was unable to carry this secret any longer. And so she waited until dark, and then she intentionally set off the family burglar alarm, knowing it would trigger police to come to her house, and then she could tell them her secret. When Alana stepped outside of the house to talk privately to one of the responding police officers, their conversation was captured on body camera. She turned her face up towards the officer and whispered 7 words that would blow this murder case wide open. I saw my mom kill my stepbrother. It would turn out Denise had decided a long time ago that the only way to really secure her relationship with Maurice and to create the family she wanted was to get rid of any reminders of Maurice's dead wife. And Martre, with his mother's wide smile and many of her mannerisms, had done everything he could to keep his mother's memory alive. Even his depression over her loss only reminded everyone how much she had meant to her family. Denise was also worried that Maurice might begin to see her own daughter, Alana, as a liability because of the constant bickering between her and Martre. So when Denise overheard Martre talking to his father about trying to secure financial aid so he could go off to art college, she saw an opportunity to make him disappear from her life altogether. That email Martre received inviting him to Full Sail University had not been sent by the college. It had been sent by Denise, who was sitting right in the next room on her laptop. And before sending that email, Denise had actually called and texted her older daughter, Latoya, and explained her plan for killing Martre, and she asked Latoya to help her, and she agreed. On April 3rd, one day after Martre's body was found, the detectives working on the murder case were getting ready to inform Martre's family that he was dead. But when the sergeant, whose officers had spoken to Alana, called to tell those investigators what Alana had said about her mother's involvement in Martre's murder, the detectives decided to hold off telling Martre's family that he was dead. If, in fact, Martre's murderer was someone inside of his own family in his own house, police did not want to tip them off by telling them that they had discovered Martre's body. Instead, investigators dug into Denise's background and they found a long history of felonies, from passing worthless checks to charges of computer fraud that had landed her in jail more than once. Then, under the guise of following up on Martre's missing person report, police returned to the Coles house to interview Maurice, Denise, and Latoya again. This time, police pressured Latoya and her mom for any information they might have about Martre's whereabouts, hoping that maybe the murderer would get spooked and do something suspicious or incriminating. At the same time, police put the green storage container that had held Martre's body back where it was first discovered in the park. Then they set up video cameras to record any activity around it. And within days, both Latoya and her mother Denise were spotted returning to the wooded area where they had left Martre's body, and much to their shock, finding the bin now empty. Police also discovered that shortly before Martre's disappearance, Denise had purchased a shovel, purple duct tape, and a substance called lime that can be used to prevent decomposition of human flesh. But most damning of all, cell phone and computer records confirmed that both Denise and Latoya had been to the wooded park on March 12th, the day Martre went missing, and these records confirmed that Denise was definitely the author of the email from Full Sail University. It was that invitation, the most promising and exciting event in Martre's life that his mother would have been so proud of him for, that lured him to his death. On July 11th, 2018, 49-year-old Denise Gay was sentenced to life in prison. Her daughter, 23-year-old LaToya Gay, was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Despite being a less than stellar parent, Maurice Coles had nothing to do with his son's death.
Layers of vocals floating in the air, lost in a moment without a care. Melodic waves of emotion, experimental synthwave devotion, classic crossover of styles untold. In this indie rock world we won't grow stop. Female vocals, a soft.
The ocean calls, I hear it clear. A symphony of waves drawing near. The sun's behind the morning mist, and the waves they twist and twist. I feel the rhythm in my bones. The sea, the sky, they are my own. The pulse of life is in the tide with every wave.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please cut in front of the 5-star review button who has been patiently waiting for their turn in the 10 items or less checkout line at the grocery store, and then proceed to pay for your completely overflowing cart with a Ziploc bag full of change. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted